Good evening, everybody. My name is Wayne Ranney, and I serve on the board of directors for the Grand Canyon Historical Society. And we welcome you to tonight's virtual outing. The Grand Canyon Historical Society, our mission is to celebrate and promote the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's cultural and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. And just last year in 2024, we celebrated 40 years of existence when the society was started by some pioneer members of Grand Canyon Village. We encourage you to become a member. Our dues are only $35 a year. We are an all-volunteer organization, and we're hopeful that many of you can join us so that we can continue to expand all of our activities like these virtual outings and in-person outings and our tri-annual history symposiums. If you do become a member, you'll get 4 issues in the calendar year of the Old Pioneer magazine, which has a lot of history articles about the Grand Canyon and the Grand Canyon region. So we do these virtual outings. We conduct tours at the South and North Rim, and you can find it on our website. Our website is very easy, grandcanyonhistory.org.
Scott Thybony, our speaker tonight, has traveled throughout North America on assignments for major magazines, including National Geographic, Smithsonian, and Outside. He wrote a cover story on the Grand Canyon for Men's Journal and a piece on canyon exploration for National Geographic magazine, translated into a dozen languages. His book, Canyon Country, sold hundreds of thousands of copies.
Yeah, this image right here is taken along the Moqui Trail, one of the branches of the Moqui Trail. It's where it drops off of the Moenkopi Plateau down into the Painted Desert. Let me set the scene here a little bit. This is probably a little more familiar to most of you. In the summer of 1776, a Franciscan priest stood on the edge of a sunken world filled with what he called the most profound canyons. He was stunned by this view, looking eastward towards what he thought was a range of mountains. And through it, the Colorado River was cutting this passageway. And in his diary, the word he used for this was los profundissimos, which gives that sense of this extraordinary depth of this canyon. He talked about how these canyons went on forever, and just remarked on the extraordinary roughness of this terrain. Father Francisco Garcés was on the 116th day of a journey that began at San Javier del Bac Mission in southern Arizona, which at the time was the most remote Spanish mission in Sonora. He traveled up the Colorado River to the Needles, and then he traversed across the Mojave Desert to the Pacific coast, and then returned to the river and decided to visit the Hopi mesas. And to do that, he had to cross northern Arizona. And he used portions of what was known at later time in the Moqui Trail. And as he was heading east, he detoured, went down to visit the Havasupai Indians down in Cataract Canyon. He used a very perilous trail, which he has a dramatic description of it in his diary. And he reached the village of Supai, spent several days there. He was welcomed by the people, found them to be very friendly, but he was finally relieved to escape from this, what he called a calaboose of cliffs and canyons. And he left by a branch of Cataract Canyon, got up on the rim, joined a group of Havasupai Indians and traveled south of the South Rim. And he continued on, dropping into the Coconino Basin, crossed the Little Colorado River, and then the little section of Painted Desert. And he went to the to Moenavi, which is that little cluster of springs west of what's now Tuba City, which is the Moenkopi Hopi pueblo. Well, when he visited Moenavi, there were Havasupai Indians living there at the time. And then he continued on. He went on to the village of Aribe, where he found a cold welcome. There's a long history of troubles with the Spanish, and they neither offered him food or shelter. And he was forced then to turn back instead of continuing on to Santa Fe like he originally planned. So he turned back and retraced the route, going by a little bit more direct route back to the lower Colorado River, where he had began his journey on segments of the Moqui Trail. He then returned down to the mission of Saint-Avir de Bac. His diaries were then transcribed by other priests, and a map was eventually written up. This image here shows the one copy of his diary in Spanish and a painting of Garcés after he was martyred at the Yuma Crossing in 1781. This map here just shows those are from 1883, shows a couple branches of what they called in those days the Moqui Trail or the Supai Moqui Trail. It often depended on what direction you're going. If you're going from Hopi to Havasupai, they call it the Supai Trail. If you're going from Havasupai to Hopi, it was known as the Moqui Trail. Now, the term Moqui is an antique word that no longer used. The Spanish used it to refer to the Hopi Indians. And a Hopi friend says they picked it up among the Pueblo Indians along the Rio Grande. And the Hopi never liked the word, and they insist on using the word Hopi for themselves because it conveys the idea not only of a people, but of an entire way of life. So the Hopi have never used that Moqui term, but it's in the historical record on the old maps and in a lot of the early accounts of expeditions. So when it refers to the trail, I tend to use it, although I go back and forth between Hopi Trail and Moqui Trail. It's best to think of the Moqui Trail as a network of routes and varieties of trails that were used different seasons for different purposes. There are two major branches. So we want to call the North Branch, which we'll be dealing with probably more in depth than the South Branch. And there were offshoots of those trails that were followed too, just to complicate matters. And if you read the early accounts of some of the early travelers on the trail, half the time they were lost, wandering around, not knowing where they were. So it tends to be difficult to follow some of these early accounts of travels on the Moqui Trail. The Moqui Trail itself was part of what the anthropologist Henry Dobbins considered to be a trade route that went from the Rio Grande to the Pacific Ocean. And one of the early canyon pioneers, Dan Hogan, he was a miner and a trail builder, and Bucky O'Neill recruited him as one of the first Rough Riders. But Dan Hogan claimed to have ridden the Moqui Trail all the way from the mountains of Colorado, across northern Arizona, down the Colorado River to La Paz. Now, Dan was combining what was usually known as the U Trail with the Moqui Trail, and then along the Colorado River, Trail of Dreams, which is a ceremonial route that began at Spirit Mountain at the tip of what's now Nevada, which is our newest. It's been now included in our newest national monument. Ceremonial trail that ran down at least as far as Yuma, probably down to the Gulf. But Dan Hogan had some interesting descriptions of the trail. When when he knew it in the 1880s, it was worn into the ground a foot deep and 2 feet wide, easy to follow. He said they tended to camp on the east side of the trail. And at those campsites, he would find ashes and pieces of cordage and lithics, flakes, sometimes arrowheads, pottery, but also shell. Now, shell was one of the trade items that was brought from the Pacific coast or from the Gulf of California over to the pueblos living in northern Arizona and along the Rio Grande in New Mexico. Now, the segment that I'm most concerned with, the Moqui Trail, from Hopi to Havasupai, the trade items there generally tended to be, the Havasupais would have buckskin and red paint. They trade to the Hopis for their pottery and their turquoise. So those are kind of the main items that were traded back and forth across the route. It's the early 1900s view of one of the Hopi villages is Walpi at First Mesa. And down in Havasu Canyon, the Havasupai, one of their homes. There's very few remnants of the old trail left. Over the years, I've found a number of them, but they're gone fast. Even in the 1940s, Dan Hogan, who knew the trail well, was lamenting that there's very little of it that he could see, only fragments. And he had lobbied the Park Service to mark the trail while it was portions still visible. When I began to first explore the canyon seriously in 1972, I began to hike as much as I could, doing these 4 or 5 day trips for a 2-week period of time. And then very quickly, I began to work as a guide, both on the trails and then on the river. And as a guide, people expected you to know something, so I had a lot of catching up to do. And I began to read everything I could on the canyon, the geology and the archaeology, the natural history, the human history. And I'd read all these early accounts of European American explorations in the area. And I kept coming across references to this Moqui Trail. And occasionally it'd be an old map and have usually an inaccurate depiction of where the trail had gone. And so I began to research, trying to find where this trail was. And I stopped by the library up on the South Rim and talked to Louise Hinchcliffe, the librarian, and she'd pull out the files, the Park Service files. And as early as the 1930s, the chief interpretation was there's some correspondence there that showed they were interested in marking this trail. And then, of course, there's the interest of Dan Hogan, who talked to the superintendent, and they wanted to get this trail marked, but then the project just sort of faded away. Often there's personnel changes, staff changes, and the person had the interest, moves on to another park, or in this case, they probably found it to be just too difficult to relocate what was left of the old trail. And so the project just disappeared. Okay, this is a map from 1777 that shows the route that Father Garcés took in 1776. And I first learned about this map a few years ago, and I went down to the University of Arizona, where it was held in the special collections. And I want to read you just a short piece out of my notes from that trip. An archivist at the University of Arizona placed a large folder on the table in front of me. She handled it so gently, I found myself opening it with equal care. Inside rested an old map, so rare only 2 copies are known to exist. It covered the northern reaches of New Spain before it became the American Southwest. And it happened to be one of the earliest maps to show the Grand Canyon. My first glimpse of the 1777 map came as a surprise. Hand-drawn and later engraved, it was only about the size of a paperback novel, but I could still make out a faint trail of dots, appearing much like a set of tracks in the dust. They indicated the route taken by an early Franciscan explorer, the same route I had followed on foot. From his base of operations at San Javier del Bac near Tucson, Father Francisco Garcés covered on horseback and mule an immense region from Sonora into distant parts of California. His role as missionary to the Indians intertwined with his wide-ranging explorations. The intrepid Franciscan preferred to travel alone without the usual military escort, and a companion said, "He appears to be but an Indian himself." The map I held depicted the land when it was still a mystery to the wider world. Only a scatter of Indian villages and a few missions filled an immense expanse of deserts and mountains, veined by a handful of rivers. While the map was more accurate than I expected, I noticed how one of the rivers took a speculative turn before disappearing into a landscape of the imagination. The map before me showed a chain of mountains reached by a river where the Colorado cut through the Kaibab Plateau. And for the first time, a map gave Grand Canyon a name, the one used by Garcés. He called it the Puerto de Bucareli in honor of the Viceroy of New Spain. Okay, this is a close-up, a detail from that map, and it shows the Grand Canyon under the name that was given by Garcés, the Puerto de Bucareli. And you can see, let me see here, this little set of dots here. This is the lower Colorado where he crossed at Needles. He followed up, paralleling the river roughly, and cut across. It doesn't show his detour down to Havasupai, but he's going south of the south rim and then crossing the little Colorado at the Hopi Trail crossing, and then on eventually to Oribe, where he was turned back by the Hopi, who were uncharacteristically not friendly throughout their history with Europeans, except for some brief violent encounters with the Spanish. They were very welcoming of parties of travelers that passed through. Yeah, Garcés eventually was martyred down when he set up a mission at the Yuma Crossing in the lower Colorado River. Okay, this contemporary map shows a red line of the route we took in 1976. At the time, I was working at the Museum in Northern Arizona, and the director, Herman Bleibtreu, was wanting to do a bicentennial project, a project to commemorate the bicentennial. And so I suggested that we gather a group of the willing and retrace on foot as closely as we could the route that Father Garcés had taken 200 years before. He liked the idea, gave us the go-ahead. So that was my excuse to actually do some serious in-depth research on the trail. So I, again, went back, read all there were two translations I had access to of Garcés's diary. The standard one by Elliot Coos was dated back to 1900. Now, Coos was an interesting character. He was an army doctor. He was a fine ornithologist. He'd been with a military party that went down into Havasupai to set up their boundaries in 1881. He knew the area real well, and he was familiar with the Moqui Trail, the one that was known back in the 1880s and 90s. And he translated the diary of Garcés, not perfectly, made some critical mistakes, which historians are beginning to discover and correct. But he kept trying to force the route that Garcés described in his diary to the route of the trail that he was familiar with. He was familiar with the branch I call the South Branch. Garcés followed fairly closely the North Branch of the trail. Coos eventually just gave up and thought that Garcés he lost his compass, and he thought he was turned around and disoriented and didn't know where he's going, and his diary is unreliable. But as it turns out, once you make some key decisions on interpreting his diary, it's very accurate, I found. Now, okay, let me go back here to this map. Okay, some considerations when, and a lot of this information I was only able to pull out in later years. In 1976, we just had the two translations to go on, plus my knowledge of water sources. You know, to find an old route like this, the water sources are critical in this country. You know, the south of the South Rim, you know, that's just, there's scant, there's a few water pockets, a few seeps, and a very little water there. When we did our retracing of Garcés' route, I had to cache water in two places and then have us resupplied near the Grandview Look at another one. But so water sources are critical to understanding his route. But also the measurements he used. He gave the distances in leagues. Now the league is a kind of an elastic measure. Over time it changed. They had different leagues for different purposes. I remember seeing an old map, an old historic map from the 1700s that had the legends at the bottom, and they had 4 different leagues. There was a nautical league, and there was a military league, and there was a German league and a Spanish league. And so Coos and people following him generally used the conversion of 2.63 miles per league. But when I was planning this trip in 1976, I talked to the park archaeologist, Bob Euler, and he thought from his study that it had to be closer to at least 3 miles per league, even more than that. And I can't remember, he had some reasons for it. I don't remember what those were. And in later periods, I discovered that a more accurate conversion, this was a series of articles written by various experts on historic maps, antique maps from the 18th century. 3.5 miles is a more accurate conversion for the league that Father Garcés used. Once you start using that, then then his itinerary that he gives just clicks. It starts falling into place, and he ends up being very accurate, really, in his directions as far as north, south, and the various directions he gives in his itinerary. Okay, we got to go ahead from the museum director, and my wife Sandy decided that she was going to sign on and go with us. An intern at the museum, Lisa Whitney, who had been a student of mine, decided to go and make the trip. And joining us was a backcountry Park Service ranger from the Sierra, a man named Terry Gustafson. And I just met Terry on a Park Service river trip. I'd left the museum at that point, and I started working as a river ranger for the park. And Terry had gone along on this trip, and there's still too much snow in the high country, so he thought he would come with us and do this 110-mile trek across northern Arizona. He liked that sort of thing, and he turned out to be a great trail companion. And he's he's been a companion ever since, you know, a friend ever since. So the four of us ended up doing this. We started at in Havasupai country. I was unable to get permits to begin at the village of Supai and hike out a branch of Cataract Canyon called Leak Canyon, which is where the Topekova Trail goes. But we did get permission to hike down into that branch to Topekova Spring. So we began in the Havasupai country, came out, hiked along the edge of the canyon, followed the route of Father Garcés to Dripping Springs. And it was at Dripping Springs that Garcés met up with 3 Havasupai families that were camped there. One reason that Garcés was being led on a route farther north than a little bit shorter route south was that it was a period of time that there was hostilities with enemies to the south. And so they wanted to link up with other parties, you know, the strength in numbers. And so they wanted a larger group for protection to when they traveled across south of the canyon. And again, water is critical, and those families were camped above Dripping Springs, I believe, because that was the one reliable source for a large party. You know, they would have had horses with them. The Garcés party would have had horses. Father Garcés hiked out of Topekova Trail, but in 1776, they were unable to take horses on that. So he had his horses taken around by the other route, which is the Moqui Trail Canyon route. And then they were brought along and given to him up on top, on the plateau on top. So they had a lot of people, a lot of livestock. And so he talks in his diary about his guides took the livestock, took the horses and mules down a trail to a spring that was unseen. And that gave him enough time to walk across. You know, I believe it would have taken them about 3 hours to water the livestock and bring them back to the rim where the party was camped. That would have given Garcés time to hike across the Aramita Mesa, somewhere out there overlooking the canyon in the area of Yuma Point. I believe that's where he gave that great description of seeing the river just breaking through the heart of the canyon. Okay, on our trip, we back in 1976, Park Service allowed you to camp at Dripping Springs. So we hiked in, camped at Dripping Springs, came out the Waldron Trail, and then continued past Rowell. Dan Hogan said that you could see the Moqui Trail from Rowell. And then we continued, across Bright Angel Wash and up Long Jim Canyon, again, to close to the rim. And then in the Grandview area, we dropped down into the Coconino Basin, dropped down into the lower basin, and went along the rim of the Little Colorado Gorge to what's known as the Hopi Trail crossing. And it was a good hard bottom crossing. One of the problems with Little Colorado River, especially for horses and mules, any four-legged animal, is the quicksand. So they had to have a solid footing. And so the traditional crossings of Little Colorado are all areas where they've had, lava flows that have come in and left rubble from the lava flows there, or have had cliffs collapse, and you have a kind of a rocky bottom that provides a good footing for the crossing. And then the route would have gone up Hopi Trail Canyon, and Garcés went off to Moenkopi, and our party that was retracing them, we decided to go directly to the Hopi village of Moenkopi, next to what's now Tuba City. This cairn here marks the trail. You can see, let me use the pointer here. There's a remnant of the original trail cutting right up here on its way to Hopi Trail crossing. These are slides that were all taken and then scanned from 1976. The village of Supai on the left that people are familiar with. A shot there of Lisa and Sandy at Toccoba Spring at the start of the trip. It shows our camp at Dripping Springs. You can see where other campers had made fires there. You weren't supposed to make fires back in those days, but people did. You know, these days you can't camp in that area. That's all off limits. This is the route across Coconino Basin. There's Forest Service roads there. The reason there's only very few segments of the original trail is because a lot of the roads have covered up. You know, they blade a road and destroy the trail, or they reroute a road and leave the trail unused, and it just, the wilderness reclaims its own, or it gets destroyed with the cattle grazing. So there's not many remnants out there still of the original trail. These are some shots from along the way. See just the shadow here, the Little Colorado Gorge, and the route we took leading down toward it. This is right above the Hopi Trail crossing, which is the official name for the canyon, Hopi Trail Canyon there. The trail went along this bench. You could see the strata. This is where the gorge of the Little Colorado just begins to cut deep. So right above that, this area in here has a good solid footing for a crossing. These cliffs have a lot of rock art in. And then the trail Garcés took and we took went straight up Hopi Trail Canyon on the north side. That's Lisa Whitney, the intern from the museum. And this shows a segment of the original trail there with Shadow Mountain in the background. Okay, one of the petroglyphs there at the crossing, and Terry Gustafson there, he's in his Kokopelli pose there, ready to make his crossing. Getting a closer look at some of the petroglyphs. I took Park Service archaeologist Bob Euler to this site, which he hadn't known about. And I believe he recorded it, hadn't been recorded, even though it's outside the park. He was always interested in this sort of thing. There's a section we cross on our way to Moenkopi, section of Painted Desert. These guys were carrying pretty, especially Lisa there, her pack was about twice as large as mine. And this is Terry on the right there. Yeah, Terry was a great companion for these long, tedious miles of walking trails and roads. He'd always have stories to tell. And along the way, we learned about one of his adventures when he worked as a backcountry ranger in the Sierras. He went through a traumatic divorce, and he was in despair and not wondering what to do with his life. So he took leave from his Park Service job and went up to the gathering of the tribes. This was 1967, up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that was kind of the culmination of sort of the peak of the counterculture. And he came into contact with some transcendental meditation practitioners. There's only 3 or 4 in the country back then. Meditation, he learned, was the just perfect for what he was looking for. And he took more leave and eventually went and spent some months at the Maharishi's ashram in India. It so happened that was the same time the Beatles were there. And the Beatles were working on a new album and they're learning to meditate. And Terry, for those days, you know, everybody was like the height of the psychedelic era. And John Lennon would wear a paisley cape and in a Spanish shirt and wide flaring bell bottoms and a red sash. And he had glasses that had strobe lights on them that would flash off and on as he walked through a darkened room. And he wore these green Egyptian slippers with the toes curled up. And Terry just wore his khakis and had a trimmed beard. He just looked like a off-season park ranger. And so it became a running joke there with John Lennon. Every time he'd run into Terry, he says, Terry was from Tucson. And so he said, Terry, why don't you get back to your bloody forest? Why don't you get back to Tucson? He says, one of us belongs there. It's either you or me. And he said, I think you ought to go ahead and get back to Tucson. And so that was a running joke. And when Terry eventually left the ashram and went back to Tucson, he was in the Yankee Doodle pizza parlor in Tucson when someone put a quarter in the jukebox and played that song that was real popular right then, a new song by the Beatles called Get Back. And they talk about JoJo leaving his home in Tucson, Arizona. And it was a song based on Terry and his experiences there at the ashram. It's a little modern history along the old Moenkopi Trail. Okay, the North Branch is one we were on, and Garcés is on. It was also followed by John Pershing when he was a young lieutenant. This was 1887. He was with his friend who wrote up a memoir of the trip after the trip, John Stotzenberg. Pershing went on to become the leader of all American forces in Europe during World War I. Became a 5-star general before he retired. Very few of those, maybe 2 or 3 of those in American history. But Stotzenberg was killed in battle during the Spanish-American War. But they decided they wanted to see the Grand Canyon, so they got leave from Fort Defiance. They headed out to the Hopi country and then across to Tuba City. And they tried to get a Hopi guide and didn't have any luck. They had a Navajo scout, an army scout with them, but he was having trouble with his horse, so he left them in Tuba City to visit relatives. And so Pershing and Stotzenberg, with their packer, a man named Minus, decided just to try to find their way on the trail. And the local Mormons there gave them the itinerary and said, make sure you don't miss this one water source. It's the only one on the route. If you miss it, you're going to die. And they followed the route. From their description, they got down to Moqui Trail crossing. And once they got on the other side, they got confused, rode 7 miles out of the way. They ran short on water. Their packer, who was utterly useless, took off trying to find water and disappeared. They finally had to abandon their horses because they played out. They had to abandon all of their gear and use the pack mules to ride. And those animals finally gave out, and they were desperate. They were close to dying of dehydration when their Navajo guide found them. He tracked them, and he brought them a canteen of water that saved their lives. And John Pershing there had left everything, even his prized Winchester carbine. He had left that behind. The one thing he didn't jettison was his flask of whiskey. So as soon as he got a little water, he made a toddy and passed the flask around to revive his companions. So they eventually found the right route and got up to the Grand Canyon at John Hance's tourist camp right on the river in the canyon. Then returned by the Moqui Trail by Lee.
What the fuck is going on?
Okay. Did someone want to come in?
No, that was a mistake. Sorry about that.
Okay. Anyway, here's Lee Tanks. Garcés talks about staying in a cave by a water pocket. I'm pretty certain it's Lee Tanks. There's some rock art in that overhang. The stone cabin was more recent. Dan Hogan called it Sinner's Retreat. He thought it was a hideout of John D. Lee, which is unlikely. Probably one of Lee's descendants had a cattle operation in the area. Here's Red Butte. The route followed north of Red Butte to Rain Tank, which is at the south end of the airport runway there, Tuesday, and then it crossed the train tracks there north of Apex siding, went on to Little Rain Tank, continued to the Moqui Trail Canyon. That's the branch of Cataract Canyon. That's where it descended. That was the primary route there in the 1880s and 90s, the one that Coos knew about. It shows some rock art along the possible route of this southern branch or the northern branch. Southern branch. Okay, this shows, I'm going to run through these a little faster. I run a little long here. This shows the route that descends from Oribe. The trail went down to Nebeto Wash to Sand Spring, up onto Moenkopi Plateau to Gold Spring, which is on top of the Adiechi Cliffs. And then there's a route there at what's known as Paiute Trail Point. When I was doing a book on the Painted Desert, the locals there, I asked them about how that got its name, and they said it was never called that. The Paiutes didn't use it. They said the Supais used it. So the map maker somehow got confused, and the south branch of the Moqui Trail descended right here into the Painted Desert. The anthropologist, the actually curator of ethnology at the Smithsonian, Frank Cushing, eccentric, but a genius in his own way. He pioneered some of the methods of what's known as participant observation, where an anthropologist actually learns the language and lives with the people he's studying and tries to keep an objective distance, which Cushing didn't always do. But he descended this route, has a good description of it that he wrote up in 2 articles that were published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1882. The route followed down to Hachi Wash. This is still in the Painted Desert, very sandy area, down to Black Point. Black Point is right here and right here in these shots. This is where the crossing, the river there takes a acute bend. There's a lot of rock art in the area. The Hopi have a name for this crossing. They also say it's where the Spanish, when the Spanish forced the Hopi to cut logs to be made into beams for their churches up on the Hopi mesas. Some of them were brought from as far away as the peaks and were brought down to this crossing and were cached there. And then another group would take them from this point to the mesas, and their name refers to that stopping point, the storage there of these beams for the churches. Actually, I was a Hopi friend took me up to Walpi once and showed me a kiva there that has one of the original beams from the mission that was destroyed in this Hopi Pueblo revolt of 1680 with the Spanish carving still on it. This petroglyph probably marks the trail there where it climbed up on Black Point. There's also a European style cross there, and archaeologist Bob Euler had told me years ago that the Spanish used to mark crossings. This may be one of theirs. It's always hard to see. Here's some of that Black Point. Some of the remnants of the trail that are in the Black Point area. Cushing, when he gives a description of traveling the route, talks about the extreme difficulty and the stoniness of the trail that he took going up on this Malpai, this lava rock. And he was very likely coming up this section of the trail here And up on top, there's a Hopi trail shrine. The park ranger at Wapaki, Hopi, showed him this shrine. And the ranger took the director of the museum, Colton, to it in the 1940s. And that's where I first heard about it. I came upon a photo that Colton had taken of the trail shrine. There's another variation of the trail. Instead of going up onto Black Point and across Black Mesa, it went along the Little Colorado River to Tappan Spring. Tappan Spring is a good water source there, just west of where Cameron is to these days. And then the route followed up Tappan Wash. And then it branched off. There's one route went up Tappan Wash onto Gray Mountain, and another one went up Cedar Wash, and eventually went up Lockwood Canyon and continued on to Red Horse Spring, and then north of Red Butte and on to Moqui Trail Canyon. It shows that route that went up into Gray Mountain. Now the Hopis up there at farther west of this, up at Skinner Ridge, that was one of their traditional hunting areas, and they still use it today, which is south of the South Rim. This is a shot of walking a section of the segments of the old trail. Okay, I'm going to kind of wrap up here a little bit and just say that over the years, putting together this trail, one thing I discovered is that these trails not only take you across the landscape, but it's also just a great way of taking you deeper into the landscape. Gives you a chance to learn more, about the people, who for centuries have lived in place here and have used these routes for all different purposes, trading, war, just traveling for the hell of it, And it goes back thousands of years. Along one segment of the existing trail, I found a paleo Indian point that goes back, probably 12,000 years. So you get this real time depth by spending time following these old routes. So, okay, I'll go ahead and leave it open to any questions people have here, because we may have a few minutes left here. Anybody who wants to ask about things, or if they've given Tom any questions.
Scott, that was really amazing. I've got some questions right off. The thing that I find most fascinating is the scarcity of water between Aztec Tank, not too far east of today's Red Butte, and the Little Colorado River. That's a long way.
And that Aztec Tank, that name I don't believe is on the current maps. There were some references to a spring actually on the just north of Red Butte, and their trail may have passed that at one time, but the Havasupai say that it was destroyed in an earthquake. So, and what happens too is that you read some of these early accounts and they talk about springs. One of the key spots on the trail was Red Horse Spring, and it got its name because the ponderosa pines there had been stripped. The larger pines sections had been stripped of bark to the smooth section of the tree, and then pictographs. The Indians had painted pictographs on the trees themselves, and one of them was this, very well painted red horse, which gave the name to the spring. There's no longer a spring there. It was a dugout spring, a seep. And in the early days of the stagecoach road to the South Rim, the John Hance's camp went right through there. And then the east-west, Moqui trails passed through there too. But very quickly, it was a limited source of water. So they dug it out, and there wasn't enough water there for all the livestock, especially once tourists started using it. So what they tend to do is they would put a check dam in there, and they would dig out a tank to try to hold more water. But then that tank tended to silt in, and that would cover up the original spring. So these little seeps now are, you have Red Horse Tank, you don't have a spring. You have Deer Tank, you don't have Deer Spring, which is near Desert View. But so yeah, when Frank Cushing in 1881 crossed there, even though you're up there in the pinyon juniper, he called it a desert, because there's just very little surface water. So you have to know where these little pockets are. Well, the Coronado expedition, when Cardenas was sent to look for the Colorado River in 1540, guided by Hopis, and they were being led probably on a wild goose chase, a 20-day trip, which eventually took them looped around near Desert View, inaccessible, a place where they could see the river, but it was inaccessible. But on their outward journey, they would bury pots of water so they could use on their return. So that was one technique they would use in dry stretches. But all these early European American expeditions, almost all of them were in the summertime, and the Zuni and the Hopi would always tell them, hey, have patience, come back after the rains, this is the wrong time of year. But they ignored his advice, and so they were there when these water pockets were dry, and so almost all of them ran into trouble. They all struggled with thirst, crossing that stretch of country.
That makes perfect sense, that they're seasonal routes and they're weather dependent.
Yeah.
For the big distances between known springs.
Yeah, and they would try to carry, water with them too, especially in horseback. The what I call the south branch of the trail there from across the Pina Desert between Trail Point and Black Point. One reason that was used by horse parties was popular by horseback riders was up on top there was grazing on the Moenkopi Plateau. You get grass for your livestock. And there's a spring there. And then that was the shortest distance across the desert, the Pina Desert. You only had 15 miles there. And they often found water in the bed of the Little Colorado. Even after it went dry, there was a pretty good water pocket right there at the crossing. That would eventually dry. It lasted weeks longer than the river would. And then they would cross up on top. They'd get on top of Black Point there and cut across. And then just beyond where the Spiderweb Ranch is now, there are a couple of pretty deep water pockets in the lava and the basalt outcrops in that area. And those could be relied on, except in the real drought times of year.
So Scott, speaking of water, Terry Cleland is asking, what time of year did Garcés make his journey, and was your reenactment at the same time of year?
No, Garcés did his in the end of June. Like he was on the rim of the Grand Canyon there, looking, at those profound canyons. June 28th, I believe, something like that. He was at Hopi, got turned back at Hopi on July 4th. So that gives you some idea of the time of year. He was there before the monsoons. And so water was critical. That was another reason that why they probably used the dripping springs, because that was a permanent water source. It took some work to get down in the canyon there, but they had water. Row Well might have had a little seep there they could use. Beyond there, it was just sheer luck to find good water sources. We did our trip in May, early May. So it was a dry time of year. That was one reason I put out a couple of water caches.
Okay, that makes sense. Werner wants to know how much of the trail is open where you don't need permission to hike it.
Well, it's difficult in the Havasupai country. Their reservation expanded in the 1970s. So even back in the 1970s, it was difficult getting permission to hike above the spring. Now, I was able to get permits there a couple times to hike down, Lee Canyon on the Topekova Trail, and but they never liked you going above there in the upper parts of Carter. Sometimes they'd get permission. It depended a lot on the tribal council at the time or the mood of the people there. Sometimes it was closed, sometimes open. These days, as far as I know, they don't give permission to hike, for anyone to hike above Havasu Springs. So that would be off. Now, anything going through the national forest is fine. And a lot of it goes through national forest. But again, once you get to the Navajo reservation, and you reach the Navajo reservation, when you cross the Little Colorado River, you need permits at that point from the Navajo tribe, but they're very open about giving backpacking permits, so you can get permits all the way through there. Back to.
Okay, Craig Shellbach wants to know, how recently have you been on any segment of the trail?
Well, I've been on segments there. There's another project I've been involved with, investigating other things along the Little Colorado near Black Point and up in the Tappan Wash area. So there are segments in those areas I've been on, just in the last couple of years.
Cool. Eric wants to know, what's the best book to learn more about this trail?
I don't know of any. No, the diaries. There's two, translations. The standard one by Elliot Coos, 1900, but it has some. Doesn't give you very good information on the trail. The other translation was by John Galvin in 1967, I believe. He made no attempts to pin down the route that Garcés took, but he's got a decent translation of the route. If anybody wants more specifics on it, they could contact me, and I can give them the kind of a rough itinerary of where those trails, the branches of those trails.
Hey, Scott, why don't you stop your screen share, and we're just going to open this up to the entire group for Q&A here.
Okay, I'm out.
Really good. And Susan, I'm not sure, can you unmute everyone? Or if you have individual questions for Scott, just go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in. I saw an aside from Kern Nuttall, who said Frank Cushing had a close relationship with John Wesley Powell, almost like a son. Powell writes the intro to Tales of the Zuni book, which is only 99 cents on Amazon. And
that's an interesting connection.
Tom, that's actually me. Sorry.
Oh, hey, Cindy, how are you?
Yeah. Hi. Good.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I didn't know those. It's interesting once you start. Back in those days, I guess it was a little smaller world than it is now, and so a lot of these people out here exploring in the West, there's lots of overlaps there of these individuals.
Well, of course, they were working at the Smithsonian. Powell was publishing, and that's the whole ethnography thing.
How's that?
That they were associated with the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian was publishing these reports.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Powell likely would have gotten Cushing a job there as the curator of ethnology at the Smithsonian.
Right. And the other thing is Frank Cushing died quite young, supposedly choking on a fish bone.
Well, I've heard that the Zunis attribute that to the retribution for him revealing the secret ceremonies that he was not authorized to reveal to write.
Right. I'm sure that didn't play very well.
Yeah, he was able to become initiated into many of these societies, even the most powerful ones, the Bo priesthood. And matter of fact, on this trip to the Havasupai, with his guides from Zuni, they took a roundabout way coming back, because the one thing he lacked, they wouldn't initiate him into the priesthood unless he had a scalp of an enemy. And he tried to fake it. He had a friend at the Smithsonian send them out of their collections. He showed it to the Zuni priests, and they rejected it. But on the way back, they looped south, closer to the Mogollon Rim in the Apache country. And Cushing talks about it in kind of vague ways. You never know for sure if he was the one who took the scalp or one of his companions. But anyway, they arrived back at Zuni with a scalp of an enemy that he gave to the priests, and they accepted it, and he was then initiated into the priest. But then he wrote about all this stuff that he was not authorized to write about. So.
Right.
So he's not particularly popular there on Ziggy today.
Right.
Hey, Scott, Peter wants to know what sort of provisions did Garces bring with him? And what about the indigenous peoples? Did they forage along the way, or was all the time dedicated to the walking?
Well, they had trail foods that they would take. Now, if they're in Garces' time, they were all mounted when they were traveling, at least his party and the Havasupais he were with. So they could pack a lot of supplies with them. Earlier days when they used to run that trail, they'd run it on foot, long distances, and they'd take very little food with them, a little bit of parched corn that was ground up and then sometimes mixed with other flavorings and carried in a little pouch. And that was kind of their power food that they would make a gruel out of and eat that. Now the Havasupai, when they're going, one of the sources I used to get a good idea of the route that Garcés took, there's a Havasupai ethnography written by Spear based on his field work among the Havasupai in 1918. So he talked to these Supai who had gone along the route on journeys to Hopi, and they'd usually take on horseback, anywhere from 4 to 6 days, but they could take an entire winter, depending on what they were interested in doing. Sometimes along the way, they'd stop and hunt. They set up a hunting camp. Then they addressed they're famous for their buckskins, these real soft, beautifully tanned buckskins that they would take and trade to the Hopis. So sometimes they would do that along the way. Other times they just do a straight shot. And sometimes Hopi or even Navajos started using it in later years. And sometimes the trail was just used and Navajos would run it. And just to go for the peach ceremony down at Supai, just for the fun and the chance to meet the girls and, whatever was happening down there in those days. But yeah, the foods and stuff, yeah, they would just take trail foods with them. They wouldn't bother, in most cases, to try to hunt or gather along the way.
And okay, we've got a question which you touched upon at the start of the talk, was the antique word Moqui. That word, is that, remind us again the meaning of that word today as we understand it.
Okay, yeah, the origins of it are a bit obscure, but a Hopi friend says that among the Hopis, they believe that it came from a pueblo people living along the Rio Grande. I can't remember which of the pueblos right now, but that linguistic group, their word for Hopi was Moqui. And so the Spanish picked it up from the Pueblo Indians and they applied it to the Hopi. Hopi had never liked it because it's very close to a word they have that means the dead. And over time, they rejected the word, and over time they've been able to convince people to use a proper term for themselves, which is Hopi, which means not only the people, but their entire way of life. And the reason I still, use this old Moqui Trail is because it's a term that it has a historical depth to it. You find it on the old maps. You find it in the old exploring accounts of these exploring parties, So for historical purposes, I figured, well, yeah, we use Moqui Trail, but of course these days the term is no longer used at all. And if you'd use it in a modern context, it would be offensive to the Hopi or to some Hopis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you have any idea whether this route that connected Cataract Canyon, Havasupai area, with the Hopi mesas, do you have any sense that this route, as Garcés had traveled, continued south along the Colorado, continued east to the coast? You mentioned trading.
I mentioned that Henry Dobbins, an anthropologist, he wrote a paper on years ago on the trade routes, and there was a trade route that went from the Rio Grande to the Pacific, and one of the key items on that were shells. Matter of fact, when Garcés traveled to visit the Hopi, he was carrying with him shell and beads, gifts to the people he encountered along the way. So these were items that were prized by the people, that were difficult because they had to come from either the Gulf of California or from the Pacific coast. But so yeah, they're known and studied trade routes. And then I mentioned Dan Hogan, who claimed that he had ridden the Moqui Trail from Colorado down along the lower Colorado. But he actually he thought that was all the Moqui Trail. Actually, just the east-west portion across northern Arizona would be considered a Moqui Trail. The portion going north into Colorado would be the U Trail. The portion going south and along the Colorado River, he took it as far as La Paz, which is no longer a town, it's a ghost town there. But he was following most likely what's came to be known as where the Pai Indians and the Mojaves and the Quechan down at the Yuma Crossing. It was often referred to as the Trail of Dreams, and it was a trade route, a route of war, used during times of war, exploration. But it was also a ceremonial route, and young men would run it as part of an initiation. But it began at Spirit Mountain, which is at the tip of modern Nevada. You go to Bullhead City, and just beyond, you run into Spirit Mountain. And that was just announced last week. It's going to be included in a new national monument. So it started there, and that was like the place of origins. For a lot of these Pai people, Spirit Mountain is where they believe that the people, the spirit people entered this world and peopled this world, much like the Sipapuni in the Little Colorado River. Some of the Hopi believe all people came out of the former worlds into the present world.
Right. I was thinking about these trade routes, and then from the Rio Grande, you could clearly make your way into the Great Plains and continue further east. And just thinking about
sure.
the indigenous connectivity of the Americas and North America, South America, pretty impressive, which we tend to forget today as we're barreling along some highway somewhere, that this was an indigenous route, thousands of years ago. I sort of forget.
Well, yeah, people even pre-horse days, just foot travel. It's always amazed me some of the distances they covered, and these people are all great runners too. So they would often run long distances along these trails. Matter of fact, back in I think it was the 1970s, John Anarino, who wrote hiking guides and a good photographer, and he was a runner, and he ran what he thought was he considered to be one of the trade routes, the Moqui Trail. He took a route that dropped into the Grand Canyon itself. And he ran along the Tunnel Trail and made his way to Supai that way. But he ran that, dressed in indigenous. I think he had wore a Hopi kilt, and I don't know if he wore sandals. He might have worn sandals, knowing Anarino, but anyway, that was another retracing a little bit different route than we did.
Right.
But early Spanish explorers traveling up the Colorado River ran into Hopis in that lower Colorado, that come to trade. So great distances, and they would often travel, trade from one people would travel to trade to the next village and the next. But also there are traders that would just go to few distances. Not to mention the ones that would come up from Mesoamerica, would get the macaw feathers, or bring those up to Puchtecas, and those were long distance trade routes. And that's where you had individuals going long distances, not village to village trading.
And the ball court players, today's soccer, we're all excited about that, but these people had teams and they traveled great distances, and so it's all fascinating just thinking about.
Well, Northern Arizona has prehistorically, there's 14 ball courts that were probably influenced by the Hohokam down in southern Arizona. Although the ones in northern Arizona were a little bit later period than the Hohokam. Very similar in design, may have had some of the same ceremonial functions.
Excellent. Well, with that, again, the floor is open. If you have any questions for Scott, unmute yourself. And otherwise, we will think about wrapping it up for tonight. And Anne says, thanks for all this info, and the picture's very interesting. So that's good. All right. Well, I just want to remind everyone that on January 10th, the first virtual outing of 2023, Kalkiani Yazi will speak about the indigenous places, their past and present connections to Grand Canyon. Looking forward to that. I want to thank Susan Collins tonight for her emceeing this presentation in the background. And Scott, thank you so very much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. And
I'm sure, it's my pleasure.
I wish everyone a good night.